Welcome everybody. Joe did a great job of giving you a wonderful introduction to wildlife management and some of the things to be thinking about for your property. And I'm going to build on what he introduced you to with a little bit more detail specifically related to managing your woodlands for birds. And so at Maine Audubon, in collaboration with Inland Fisheries and Wildlife and the Maine Forest Service and the Forest Stewards Guild, we developed a program a number of years ago called Forestry for Maine Birds. And the idea behind this program is we're offering suggestions to private landowners like yourselves, to commercial landowners, to loggers, and to professional foresters on how you might be able to manage your woodlands to benefit birds. So I'm gonna go through kind of a very general introduction to this program. And as I mentioned, some of you may have heard at the beginning, there's a lot more to learn from our website or from additional presentations or workshops that you'd be able to attend. But first I want to start with a little background about why Maine is so important for birds. We have about 90 different species that breed in our forests here in Maine. And this is a map that was put together by the National Audubon Society a number of years ago that shows where the largest blocks of forest habitat remain in the eastern United States. And you know, what jumps out right away to you from this slide, right? The biggest green blob is in Maine, Western Maine, Northern Maine, Down East Maine, those, and even Southern Maine, which also has a lot of forested land, but isn't necessarily a contiguous block of forest land. So Maine has the biggest block of forest land for these eastern forest birds and boreal birds in the entire eastern US. We're sort of used to it here, we take it for granted, but I wanted to give you some idea of just how important this is on a national level and on an international level. So speaking of international level, much of Maine, the red area there in western and northern Maine, has been designated as a globally significant important bird area. What this means is that their important bird areas have been designated around the world as places that are super important for either a lot of one or two different species of birds or many different species of birds that gather in one place. So in the case of northern Maine, we're talking about 90 different species that are breeding here in our state, and they are coming back to Maine. Many of them are coming back to Maine from very far away. So again, you can see that in Maine, this is the largest globally significant important bird area in the entire United States. We also know that we've seen a dramatic decline in our bird populations since 1970. In 2019, there were a number of researchers that got together and they looked at 17 different sets of data that were tracking long-term trends of bird populations. And they were able to document that we have lost nearly 1/3 of all the birds that used to be here in North America since 1970. That's a dramatic decline. And if you look at the declines by different species groups, you can see that the group of birds that's been hit the hardest are our grassland birds. So these birds, maybe some of you have a combination of woodlands and fields and farmland on your properties. And there's a whole program called Ag Allies here in Maine that focuses on helping landowners like yourselves improve habitat for grassland birds, but today I'm really going to be focused on our forest birds. But you can see our boreal forest birds, we've seen 33% decline, and our eastern forest birds, a 17% decline. And that's across many species, not just one or two species. Looking a little bit more closely at this, for our eastern forest birds like this yellow-rumped warbler you see here in the center of the page, we've seen a 17% decline across at least 64% of all the species. And if you're talking about numbers, we're talking about 167 million fewer birds today. than in 1970. It's almost impossible to imagine 167 million birds, right? But it's a lot. And in the boreal forest birds, these are our birds that, like the bay-breasted warbler pictured here, that tend to breed in far the northern Maine and then also across much of Canada. We've seen an even steeper decline and a loss of over 500 million birds. Another way to think about this is just even 20, 30 years ago, when, or 30 plus years ago when I was starting to do a lot of this work, 1 in 4 of the eastern forest birds that I used to see and hear out in the woods, it has disappeared for our eastern forest birds, and 1 in 3 of those boreal birds has disappeared. I've talked to a lot of folks who have been watching birds for 40, 50 years that say, you know, there just aren't as many birds out there. And that's true, there aren't. So we're trying to work with landowners, with land managers, with loggers, with foresters, and many different organizations to work with landowners on how can we bring some of these birds back? How can we make sure that we create good, healthy habitat that will keep these birds coming back to Maine and breeding and making more birds? So one of the things that is kind of may surprise you a little bit about our forest birds is that each different species that you can see pictured here in this mural in the circles uses a different type of forest and a different place in the forest. So for example, here we have the black-burnian warbler, which loves to sing from the top of evergreen trees. And then by contrast, we have this Canada warbler down here that loves to nest and sing from the forest floor or just a little bit above the forest floor. They like to be near wetlands or water and hiding out in those really dense thickets of shrubs or overturned logs on the bottom of the forest floor. And then we have species that like mixed woods, the hardwood softwood mixture, and something like a yellow-bellied sapsucker needs those snags that Joe was talking about, those dead standing trees. That's where they're feeding and nesting. And then these small gap openings that were typical of our forests when big old trees would fall down and bring a couple other trees down with them. You get what we call aerial insectivores, or birds that sit on a perch at the edge of the opening and then fly out into the opening and feed on insects that are flying out there. So they're eating while they're flying. Over here on the deciduous or hardwood forest, scarlet tanagers love the tops of big oak trees that have a full canopy, whereas something like a veery likes to be near water, down on the forest floor. They're feeding in that leaf litter that Joe mentioned and picking up the invertebrates that are underneath those leaves. And also we have things like ovenbirds that are nesting right down on the forest floor. And then over here on this mural, you can see that each different species has a different migratory pathway. Most of the birds that breed here in Maine are migratory, although some are resident. And here you see 3 different migratory pathways. The light tan colored ones are for our woodcock. So they fly back and forth between Maine and southern US every year. And then the red represents the scarlet tanager. So they breed in Maine and some other areas further north. They fly all the way down to South America in the fall, and they return in the spring on much the same route. And then we have something like the blackpoll warbler that's represented by these black lines. They fly up they overwinter in South America, eastern Brazil, and they fly up kind of break into 2 different groups, one that goes up to Alaska and one that flies up to the eastern US and up into Canadian taiga forest. But then in the fall, all the blackpoll warblers from across North America come back to Maine or New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and they literally jump off the coast and fly nonstop all the way down to South America. It often takes them, it's an 1,800-mile flight, takes them a couple of days to get down there, 88 hours. You know, it's just remarkable. And then in spring, they come back again. So these birds need a lot of food and energy to keep going. But why are we so focused on birds? You know, I've given you some background on that, but anything that we do to help provide good habitat for these birds also means that we're providing habitat for many other wildlife species, including bobcats, marten, moose, brook trout, and it also provides great recreational opportunities, whether you like to hunt, whether you like to fish, whether you like to just walk through your woods, whether you like to snowshoe or snowmobile, whatever it might be. You know, anything that you do to improve wildlife habitat also improves the forest for many other species and your own enjoyment. So what we've done with the Forestry for Maine Birds program is we've identified what we call 20 priority bird species. These are species that are representative of all the 90 species that actually use our forests for breeding. They are found in 4 different forest types, and they use 8 different habitat features. And not only that, but they're beautiful, right? They're beautiful. They have these amazing songs, and they're really fun to watch. And you tend to be able to see and find birds much more easily than you can find other wildlife species. So that's another reason to kind of develop your interest in birds. Each of these species are either in dramatic decline and or a large portion of their population breeds here in the Northeast and often in Maine. So they are all considered species of conservation concern, in addition to being, and then we chose species that we thought would be relatively easy to identify by sight or sound. So we put together a number of guidebooks that can help you look at your own property and figure out what kind of habitat do you have now and what would you like to do to potentially improve that habitat. This guide on the right here is our most detailed one, and it was originally developed for foresters. It has a lot of background information and specific recommendations for foresters. But then we also, from that, created a more condensed version for woodland owners with this guide. And then we have a specific guide that we developed for loggers. So those people that are actually working the land, doing any harvesting on your property, that gives them some tips on things they can do that will help protect habitat and create habitat, like brush piles, for example. And finally, we have these wonderful trading cards here that each of the 20 different species is highlighted on the front, and then on the back you see a little bit about what their habitat needs are. And you can take this ring of cards right out in the woods with you to help you with your identification. So what we're trying to get at is a lot of the same things that Joe talked about in his presentation. We're really looking at how can we create more structural diversity. So we've got more vertical diversity and more horizontal diversity in the forest. We've got trees that are of different species, different heights, different ages, and are creating this wonderful hotel full of many different places for different species to breed and feed and raise their young. And we know that the more structurally complex the forest is, whether it's the hardwood forest on the left or the softwood forest on the right, we're going to get more wildlife diversity as a result. So really, one of the goals we're trying to promote through this program is try to create more structurally complex, mature, uneven aged forest stands. And a quick way to sort of figure out what you have on your property and what you might be able to do to enhance that is through what we call this quick habitat assessment. All you need are your 6 fingers, or if you're feeling really brave, all 10 fingers. And each finger represents a different habitat feature that we want to look for in the forest. Is it there? What's the quality? How could we maybe improve it if it's not there? So each finger represents different habitat features, many of which Joe talked about in his talk. So gaps, the overstory, the midstory, the understory, water. Those are on your left hand. You can kind of think of those as the living elements of the forest. And then on the right side, we're talking about, do you have any big old trees? If so, you might want to keep those. Do you have some dead standing snags, coarse woody material, fine woody material, and then that leaf litter? And those are more or less the dead features of the forest. Once live, but now dead. So we start by looking at, what is the forest type? Do you have an oak pine forest, a northern softwood forest, a northern hardwood forest, or a mixed wood forest? What's the age? What's the tree size? What the general characteristics? And what are the dominant species that are in the forest? And then we look at those 3 layers that Joe mentioned, where we have the overstory that's over 30 feet high, the midstory between 6 to 30 feet, and the understory, and ask what's the quality of that understory? What are the dominant species? How dense is the canopy cover? Do we have all 3 layers, or do we just have 1, or do we just have 2 layers? And as you can see from this graphic, there are different bird species that are associated with each of these different layers. And then we're going to look for the standing dead wood. For something like a pileated woodpecker, you need a pretty good sized tree, at least 14 to 16 inches in diameter, in order for them to excavate a cavity nest. And the larger the snags or dead standing trees, the larger animals you're going to get using those. Something like a wood duck, which often nests half a mile away from water. They need pretty good sized tree in order to have their nest in that cavity. Something like a chickadee, which is also a cavity nester, needs a much smaller tree. So you can have a variety of sizes of snags, but you want to have some that are really pretty big. And then when those trees fall down and they're on the ground, that's a great place for something like a ruffed grouse to drum. And probably many of you have heard, when the male is trying to attract the female, they are on the log and they're beating their wings, and they kind of sound like, and it reverberates through the woods because they're standing on this dead log, and it amplifies the sound. And those dead logs down on the forest floor are really great travel corridors for things like fisher and marten and foxes. And they're also wonderful places for those mammals to forage to seek small mammals, amphibians. A lot of our redback salamanders will be found under these dead decaying logs. So, and insects, bears sometimes rip these things apart to try to find insects or ants, and they really create great habitat. And then Joe also mentioned the importance of leaf litter. That's one of the places where a lot of insects collect, but also something like an ovenbird needs a pretty good layer of dead hardwood leaves in order to make their nest. They nest right on the ground, and they build a nest that looks sort of like an oven with a side entrance. So you're looking into the nest of this ovenbird right there. And if you don't have a good leaf litter, we're talking maybe inch and a half deep, then you're probably not going to have any ovenbirds nesting there. And I don't know how many of you know your birds, but ovenbirds are one of the easiest birds to learn how to recognize by their song, because it's a very loud, booming teacher, 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 teacher that they keep repeating over and over again throughout the day. And then another feature that we really encourage folks to try to create are these small gap openings. You might remember this is where the aerial insectivores like phoebes or eastern wood peewees like to perch on the side of the opening and then fly out into the opening and catch insects. Bats also. And once vegetation starts growing up in that opening, now that you've got a lot of sunlight in there, then you get certain birds like chestnut-sided warblers that like young forest and patches of young forest amid the older forest. Then that creates a diversity in both plant and animal species. And then we really encourage you, where you do have older forests already existing or older trees that have been sort of remnant trees remaining, what we might call legacy trees that never got cut before, those are becoming more and more rare across the Maine landscape. And so if you can, save those, keep them. They are super important for storing carbon. They contribute to climate resilience. They provide, later on, as they die off, they provide those cavities for the large mammals and birds. Excuse me, just needed a drink. And they're, as I say, increasingly rare on the landscape, so we want to protect them. And then I would just like to reiterate what Joe said about the importance of riparian habitat around our wetlands, our streams, our ponds. We know that about 85% of all of our vertebrate species, those are wildlife species with backbones, use these riparian areas at some time during the year as part of their life cycle. These areas are also used as important travel corridors where animals are moving from one part of the forest to another part of the forest. They're really, and they are super important filters for keeping sediment and other pollutants out of water bodies. So we definitely want to take special care of these riparian areas. And on the landscape of today, these are often areas that have some of the older trees and more structural diversity because people have taken good care of them. So reinforcing that is terrific. So putting it all together, when you walk out into your back forest and you want to kind of assess what does it look like and what can I make improvements, here's a little summary of that. So in this case, there aren't very many big old trees, so try to create some more vigorous canopy trees where things like a scarlet tanager would be happy. And as Joe described, you can cut around, if you have an oak tree, maybe it's doing okay, but it could use a little more sunlight, a little more opening. You can remove some of the trees right adjacent to it so that it can develop a much more vigorous canopy. We also want some of those small canopy gaps for our eastern wood pewee and other insect eaters. We will, here there's very little mid-story, right? That area between 6 to 30 feet. And so we'd like to see more of that for things like a hermit thrush and wood thrush that like that mid-story, dense mid-story. We want to make sure that we keep snags or create them if there aren't any, so that we have cavity trees for all of our woodpeckers and other species that like to use woodpecker holes afterwards. And then we also need the dense understory for, I mentioned the Canada warbler earlier, but also our black-throated blue warbler pictured here. They really love hobblebush and they will nest right in and under those dense shrub layer. On the ground, you need that nice leaf litter for things like the ovenbird to nest. And then we need more of those down trees on the ground for ruffed grouse and martin and fisher and those sorts of things. And then one of the things that Joe touched on early in his talk that I also want to just emphasize again is that it's important to think about how your particular property fits into the larger landscape. And it used to be pre-settlement days, Maine, about 80% of the landscape was covered with older forest. We're talking over 150 years old, big trees, and these small opening gaps that occurred across the landscape. But today, we have only about 2 to 4%, in some cases 6% of the landscape that is made up of these mature forests. So it's a type of the age class that we're really missing, and that's where you get more species and packed into a small area. So we're really trying to encourage folks, to the degree that you can, to find opportunities to either keep or grow that mature forest. And if you are starting with a young forest or an intermediate forest, there are things that you can do with active forest management to actually sort of speed up the process to getting to these older forest conditions. It doesn't necessarily have to be 150 years old to provide the habitat features that these birds that are adapted to those mature forest conditions can do well in. So, and in this case, what we ideally would be looking for over time is a landscape that's composed of around 10 to 20% young forest, 20 to 40% intermediate age forest, 40 to 50% older forest, with at least 10% of it in this very mature habitat size. And what these numbers refer to underneath, the dBH is the diameter at breast height. So if you think about 4.5 feet high, young forests often have trees that are less than 5 inches, whereas the mature forest would have something that's greater than 16-inch diameter. And then the ages you can also see down here at the bottom. So a couple other things I'm going to mention. We've been working with a number of private landowners, land trusts, and the Soil and Water Conservation District on creating what we're calling demonstration forests that illustrate these practices or these ideas in practice. And then we have created signs that talk about each of the different habitat features that we're trying to encourage within these demonstration forests. And these all come from the Yankee Woodlot, which is in Skowhegan. And you can see this one here is the canopy gap, and then here are 3 signs that are actually placed out in the woods that touch different topics: a gap opening, the 3 layers of vegetation, and snags. We have a total of 9 different signs that are available to be used at different sites. And then finally, we are working on a companion piece called Forest for Fish, where we're really trying to make the connection between what you do in the forest and on the upland really affects what happens in our waters. And whether it's a stream, whether it's a vernal pool, whether it's a pond or a lake, there's so much life in these waterways that is influenced by what happens on the upland. Just as one example, our brook trout really need clear, cold water. And if you remove too much of the canopy adjacent to these creeks, then the water becomes really warm. They have trouble. Breeding. They have trouble moving from one place to another. They have trouble finding cold water refuges in the summertime. And so we really want to try to keep that shade and also have the buffer of those trees that are going to keep erosion and other pollutants from getting into the water. And then the vernal pools, as Joe talked about, many of the species are wood frogs, spotted and blue spotted salamanders, will travel up to as far as a quarter mile or half a mile easily away from the pool where they're breeding. And so it's really important to think about managing the forest upland areas around the vernal pool in addition to just the vernal pool. And we do have some really great forest habitat management guidelines for vernal pools that you can reference if you're interested in that. So that is it. I'm going to stop there, and I encourage you to, if you're interested in wildlife, if you're interested in wildlife habitat protection and conservation, we'd love to have you join us at Maine Audubon. We have lots of other programs and reference materials that you might be interested in. If you want more information about Forestry for Maine Birds program, you can come to our website and specifically look for Forestry for Maine Birds or FFMB. We have other printed material that you can request. We have workshops, we have videos, we have all kinds of information there. And then if you have follow-up questions, I'd be happy to answer them. There's my email address and my phone number there. So I'm going to jump out and stop sharing. And see if anybody would like to ask questions at this point.
So we had a few questions in the chat.
Okay.
You may answer this. I think this may have been from Joe's presentation, but you mentioned it as well. So with having the coarse woody debris and piles, so we had a couple questions about that. I know with NRCS, they usually, for their conservation stewardship program, usually require 1 pile per acre. Is there any reason people should do more, do less? Do they need to pile all coarse woody debris?
No. Yeah, those are all good questions. So the way I like to think of coarse woody material is if under sort of natural disturbance regime, you're going to have these big old trees that fall down, bring a couple other old trees, or you have big branches that might fall down during a windstorm. And so they're often scattered throughout the forest. When you create a brush pile, that it can be a really helpful place for animals to hide, for birds to find insects to feed on, for the snowshoe hare and other species to find cover from predators. But they can be scattered throughout the forest, and they don't, in my view, they don't need to be as big or as dramatic as the NRCS typically suggests. So NRCS has a particular standard that they want you to follow, but it doesn't. You don't have to, especially if you're doing your own work. You don't have to do that quite that way.
Thank you. Yes, those wildlife piles, those are huge.
Yeah,
So,
they're kind of ridiculous.
and it kind of makes it less work for you guys if you're not piling everything. It sounds like the wildlife prefers things to be more scattered and less uniform. We had something kind of specifically asking for recommendations on creating a more diverse mid-story.
Yes.
So, this landowner, Steve, said they have a great number of white pine saplings growing. Should we encourage with the removal of small oaks and other deciduous trees, we need to develop a mid-story mix. And I answered that very briefly just by reminding everyone about the pine weevil.
Yeah, I'm not sure I totally followed that question. Can you ask it again?
Yeah, basically they're asking, since they have some white pine saplings, some yearlings growing up, if they should encourage their pine trees by removing some of the deciduous trees to have a mid-story mix.
Well, I would say that yes, you want both oaks and pines. Often the pine seedlings get established where there's been a little sunlight that reaches the ground. And so I don't know, Alyssa, maybe you have a better answer for this than I do as the forester in terms of how you manage the balance between those two species. But we'd like to see both of those coming up in the mid-story and then eventually in the overstory.
And honestly, for forestry, it kind of just depends on your own management goals. I like to see a mix of conifers and deciduous trees. And if you're wanting to see on your property, say you don't have much white pine and that's what you're wanting to encourage, I would just wait until they're about 20 to 25 feet tall before you remove that partial shade, just so we aren't having to worry about the weevil kill to the terminal leaf. We just have to kind of hide that silhouette for a while. We had another question here for Sally about, do more birds mean fewer mosquitoes and ticks?
Everybody wants to know the answer to that, right? I mean, most of our birds that are breeding here in Maine in the summer are feeding their young caterpillar larvae. And so they're not really eating a lot of mosquitoes or black flies, I'm sorry to say, or ticks for that matter. They're really dependent on the butterfly and moth larvae. The young birds eat a tremendous amount of food as they're growing. And so that's one of the reasons that these birds make this big migration coming back to Maine every year, is because there are so many different insects that are available for them to feed their young. They're just constantly, and they often will raise 2, sometimes 3 clutches, or have 3 different nests of young in a year because of our long days, because they can feed from dawn until dusk, and because of the variety of forest types, and because of the number of insects that are found on our trees. So they may not be eating the mosquitoes and the ticks, but they are keeping the moth and butterfly population exploding and chewing and eating up all your trees.
Thank you. I have a specific bird question for you that you may know the answer to. I've noticed that we have, at least last year, we had 2 pairs of bald eagles that nested nearby. And this year, we have 4 in the exact same spot, 4 pairs, so 8 eagles total. And they're hanging out in the same spot as these eagles were last year, where the 2 other pair had made their nest. Is that normal behavior, or is there something really enticing in that area? I'm just not familiar with birds that nest in the exact same spots just about.
Well, eagles are very they have high site fidelity, meaning that they do tend to return to the same nest every year, unless something has happened to that nest, or at least in the very similar vicinity. So I'm not sure why you're seeing 8 there. Does it look like all 8 are nesting, or does it look like some of them might be immatures? Because we do occasionally see the immatures from a previous year that will come back and sort of help the parents with the nest, or hang around, I should say, at least hang around where they were nesting, where they were raised the year before or the 2 years before. But they take several years to reach maturity, the young do, before they are capable of breeding and nesting on their own. So okay. it could be that it's a combination of adults and young. I'm not sure whether that's what you're seeing or all adults, but the bald eagles usually start nesting as early as February or March, because they have a very long incubation period and then a very long period for raising the young, and they kind of like to get a jump on that early in the season.
Very cool. Yeah, I think at least 2 of them are immature. The others looked like they were adults, had the white heads, but that's great so if you guys have an area on your property where you're trying to make eagle habitat, it sounds like you might get them visiting every year if you do it right.
Yes. And they really like those big old pine trees that are near water. That's one of their favorite places to breed.
That's great. I saw one up in Frankfort not too recent. Yeah, I guess it was pretty recently, nesting on a dying pine tree. Marsh stream. Does anybody else have questions for Sally? And I will definitely send you guys a follow-up email with the Forestry for Maine Birds website, Sally's email. So if you think of questions later, you'll also get Joe's email, and I'm going to send you more specific links on the IFNW page, just so you can navigate that a little better. There's a lot of info there. Any other questions? Last chance, guys. Quiet group tonight.
Very quiet.
Last class of the year, everybody's quiet. Oh, here we go. Any advice on bat houses to be more beneficial on the control of bug, ticks, and mosquitoes?
Bats will do you much more good than birds in terms of, mosquitoes. So if you have an old house or an old barn where you might have bats nesting anyway, great. But if you don't have a natural nesting sites for them, there are bat houses that you can either purchase or build yourself that can sometimes help attract bats to your property, and then they do feed on a tremendous amount of insects. And our bat populations, generally speaking, have dramatically declined over the last decade because of a white nose syndrome, which is a fungal infection that they get that has decimated some of our species as much as 90% in just a decade or more. So anything you can do to help out bats would be great. And we have designs on our webpage. Cornell Lab of Ornithology is a great resource. They've got all kinds of different bird nesting designs and also bird feeders and that kind of thing. So check it out.
All right, anything else, guys? I'm just starting to see more of our migratory birds coming back. Sally and I were talking about this before you all joined us. Red-winged blackbirds and killdeers are back in our neighborhood. If you guys have any specific questions about migratory birds?
Once you start learning your birds, springtime becomes such an exciting time because all these different species are coming back and they all kind of come back at different times. And so every day, every week for the month of May, there's somebody new that's out there. And it can be really fun to try to learn more about who's coming through when and start learning their calls as well as I've been able to identify them from sight. And if any of you are just learning about your birds, I would encourage you to, and you have a smartphone and you are familiar with how to use that, the Cornell Lab of Ornithology that's based out of Ithaca, they have this wonderful app called Merlin, and it will help you identify birds not only by sight but by sound now. Last year they came out with a feature where you basically just hold your phone up in the air. If there are a bunch of birds singing, let's say there's 6 different birds singing close by to you, you hold your phone up in the air and slowly you can see it create a list of the birds that you're hearing. And particularly with many of our songbirds, when they first come back in the spring, that's a good time to see them before the leaves come out. But once the leaves start coming out, it can be very, very hard to find them. And so learning to recognize them by song and also taking advantage of this new app is really fun. It's really fun.
That app is excellent. I did the backyard bird count back in February, and that was very helpful.
Yeah.
So we have one more question here. We'll call this our last question. So Ellie is saying she hasn't seen any woodcock for several years now. Are they declining? And I guess, is there anything you would recommend to see more on people's property?
Well, woodcock have a pretty complex habitat need. When they first come back in the spring, they are looking for open areas where the males can do their little dance to attract the females. But they like that open area to be adjacent to kind of a shrubby, young successional forested area. And then they also like a little bit older forests for feeding over the course of the year. So they have complex habitat requirements, and they are somewhat in decline, not direly so. If you want to try to attract more woodcock to your property, I suggest you go into our Forestry for Maine Birds resources that I pointed out, the different guidebooks, because we talk specifically in there about kind of what habitat you need to create to benefit woodcock.
And if you guys schedule a visit with either Joe or your district forester, and I guess Chuck Halsey is also an inland fisheries and wildlife private lands biologist. So if you schedule with one of those guys, we can bring you Forestry for Maine bird books. Our staff and IFNW has those that we're able to share.
Yeah, and they could also take a look at your property and make some recommendations on if and where you might be able to enhance habitat for woodcock or for some other particular species you're interested in.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Sally. That was great. If we have any other questions, I'm sure people will reach out. And thank you guys for joining us.
Yes, and good luck with your whatever you're hoping to do in the future. And please get back in touch with us if you want more information. We're happy to help. And thank you, Alyssa, for inviting me.
Thank you for coming. I'm sorry to interrupt your vacation. Enjoy the rest of your vacation.
All right, thanks. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.